When it comes to first impressions, my motto is what you see is what you get. If a show is bad or mediocre in the first episode, chances are it's not going to get good enough by the end to be worth watching. The only exception I've ever made is Gintama because the anime starts on 2 filler episodes for some reason. Once the series proper starts at episode 3, it immediately becomes as fun and engaging as later seasons. However, I might need to make another partial exception for a new anime premiering today, Dr. Stone. I should mention that I don't think Dr. Stone has an overall bad start. It has a lot of elements that I love, and those elements stick around and continue to evolve throughout the series. However, there are a few major faults that made me unsure as to whether this series could grow from "this is pretty alright" to "this is amazing." It's because those faults eventually go away that I'm making this video in the first place, and I will be avoiding most major spoilers since the first episode just came out. Now, I could go on a long tangent about how anime is produced and why it leaves so little room for change, but that's not really relevant to this particular discussion and is something I'll want to cover in more depth later on. For now, all you need to know is this. TV anime requires a lot of prep time for planning, casting, writing, etc. before any animation even takes place. Usually about a year or so, but sometimes as long as 3, which is considerably more than the 3 to 6 months that an anime is airing. Additionally, scheduling work for anime productions is extremely tight to the point where any major delays will often have significant consequences on how the production moves forward. Such as how, according to former Gainax CEO Toshio Okada, director Hideaki Anno constantly made changes to the story of Neon Genesis Evangelion up until the last minute, thus resulting in the seemingly incomplete appearance of the final 2 episodes. Changing key details of an anime story while production is underway is practically impossible without repercussions because it's hard enough to just keep the animation work on schedule. However, this is not the case with manga. When all you have is an author, possibly an illustrator, and a few assistants, scheduling becomes more flexible, and with input not only from fans but also an editor, changes can be made quickly without huge delays. I'm not trying to downplay the work that a manga author goes through when I say this. It's an incredibly tough job that requires an extreme amount of effort, but because that effort comes almost solely from a single author, it's much easier for that author to make changes quickly when need be without ruining later chapters. And this brings us back to Dr. Stone. Now, keep in mind that what I'm about to discuss is purely speculation. I don't have access to Shonen Jump's ranking data, and table of contents order isn't as reliable a factor in determining said rankings anymore. So I can't say for certain that Dr. Stone's rankings were struggling in the beginning. What I am sure of is that I've personally seen many people complain about certain elements in the opening chapters, and based on the fact that those elements eventually went away, I am tentatively drawing the conclusion that other readers in Japan felt the same way. So what are those elements exactly? The biggest problem with the introductory segment of Dr. Stone is by far its characters. Well, actually just 2 characters in particular, those being Taiju and Yuzuriha. On his own, Taiju is about average as far as protagonists go. He's got an easily recognizable personality, and his goals and desires are clearly defined and concrete. He's a big oaf with a heart of gold who wants to confess his love to Yuzuriha. Yuzuriha, unfortunately, is basically just the love interest, though she does have a few choice scenes later on. However, what makes these characters fall kinda flat is that their goals are mostly disconnected from the overall plot. Taiju wanting to confess to Yuzuriha has no bearing on how everyone's been turned to stone and whether they'll be able to turn everyone back to normal. In fact, Taiju doesn't really seem all that concerned about everyone else because he's so obsessed with his crush. The only connection Taiju has to this plot is that he wants to revive Yuzuriha, which he does pretty early on. So once that's out of the way, these two don't have a lot to do to move the plot forward except listen to Senku, the much more interesting protagonist for the series. And because they don't have anything left to do except get the confession over with, that is literally the one thing that they don't do. The confession gets delayed via some of the most convoluted logic I've ever seen from this kind of scenario, and both of these characters become significantly worse because of it. If not for the fact that they're constantly in danger of being killed, I have no doubt that these two would have stood around with their thumbs up their asses waiting for the stars to align for the perfect confession moment, while Senku tries to carry the story somewhere more interesting. Now, this lack of synchronicity between desire and setting doesn't make the story an immediate drop because Senku is still being awesome all the time, but because the story frames Taiju as the central protagonist rather than Senku, this element becomes much harder to avoid. The vast majority of the first chapter's real estate is devoted to Taiju and his perspective. As I noted in my Magi analysis, the character who gets the most focus at the beginning of the story has the most sway over how the story will be perceived going forward. Because Taiju is by far the one with the most focus in chapter 1, the entire story is now framed around his perspective rather than Senku's, even though Senku's goal of freeing everyone from their stone encasements is much more compelling and fits the setting much better than a simple romantic confession. The splash page for chapter 1 also has Taiju farther forward and taking up more space than Senku, visually indicating that he is the number one character that we should focus on. Now, as this introductory arc moves along, Senku does begin to grab a bit more panel space, but it's clearly Taiju's story until he and Yuzuriha go away. Even the fact that Senku immediately becomes ideologically opposed to the story's main antagonist doesn't give him enough of a boost in importance in comparison to Taiju. So, I know all that stuff I described sounds kinda bad. If Taiju and Yuzuriha had to lead the main plot forever while Senku and his pursuit of reviving civilization are still given less importance, this would be a painfully boring story. Of course, as is the point of this video, that doesn't happen. These two characters basically go away indefinitely, making room for Senku to truly shine and flex his mental muscles. Senku, being a science whiz, has always been the best part of this series, especially in how it relates back to core shonen ideological tenets. Unfortunately, a lot of it felt a bit restrained in the early chapters because the story still had to deal with Taiju and Yuzuriha, which resulted in the science elements being more of a gimmick to aid the characters randomly in certain moments. Once the two lovebirds go away, the scientific experimentation becomes much more intensive, with certain tasks often continuing across several chapters, allowing the details of each task to gain more prominence and the sense of scale more perspective as Senku moves on to crazier and crazier ideas. We also get a much more interesting cast of characters that are able to play off of Senku's eccentricities much better than Taiju or Yuzuriha. Giving Senku people to interact with who can actually understand some of the stuff he's saying instead of someone that's basically a brick wall makes it much more exciting to see him lead them on and try to coax the solution out of them before he reveals it himself. It also gives the cast a chance to surprise us with how they support Senku, rather than Taiju just beating the shit out of whatever's causing his problems. And this setup is also much more thematically coherent in regards to the story's main ideological conflict of brute force versus science and technology. Senku also gets his own potential love interest who is 100 times more interesting than Yuzuriha, and even a new side character gets a love interest, and their relationship is several times more engaging than Taiju and Yuzuriha's because it directly ties into the main plot of the story. It was never just the fact that there was a romantic subplot that held the story back, but rather that said subplot wasn't being utilized in a way that best suits the setting like later ones are. Whether these changes were the intention all along, or the author responded to possible criticism from readers, the story is much better off now than when it had first started because all of the elements that were holding it back have been cast aside in favor of a more colorful cast and a stronger protagonist. So now we arrive at the big question. How long until the anime adaptation is done with this less than stellar introduction? If I were to give an estimate, it looks like it'll take at least 4 to 5 episodes. And that's if the anime tries to get this part over with as quickly as possible. 15 chapters over 5 episodes would give it a 3-to-1 adaptation rate, which, as I said in my video on how to adapt Shonen Jump titles, is a fairly fast rate of adaptation and much quicker than the ideal 2-to-1 rate. I don't see it going much faster than this simply because there's a lot of important setup that happens in these chapters and a lot of details to cover. It's not something they can just skip over because it's important not only for setting up the world, but also how major conflicts later in the story will play out. If, however, this adaptation does stick closer to a 2-to-1 rate, then it will take at least 7 to 8 episodes for this part of the series to finish, which would make this first arc much more difficult to watch because we'd be stuck with 2 mostly boring characters overshadowing the much more interesting character for 8 whole episodes. Hopefully this production leans more towards the faster rate for this opening arc so the audience can get to the real meat of the series as quickly as possible without getting scared off by its weaker elements. Of course, this is all assuming that the adaptation of the story is actually good and the anime doesn't just botch it entirely, which is definitely a possibility, but hopefully we get lucky and the power of science will prevail. Special thanks to Jan Rogalski, Rorkton Joing, Christine Seibert, Call Me Catlord, Ember's fave roommate, Eugenio Mendoza, and all my other patrons for their generous support. My name is Ember, and I'll see you next time.